sitting on my doorstep, the people's passing by. They're coming back from getting wrecked. Everybody's high. Saturday night, what a bitch, laying on the lawn. The morning comes to bring the switch after the buzz is gone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm your host, David Wagner. Recently, I have had a lot of people emailing and asking me to do an episode about my own experience with addiction. And it's something that I've been thinking about doing for quite a while, actually. I mean, I've got my complete story of how I became addicted to opioids typed up on the addictionspodcast.com website, and it's all over Facebook. I've posted it in several places, but it's a long story. I mean, and I think I can do a little bit better justice by doing an entire episode on it. So that's what we are going to be talking about today. But before we get to that, I would like to first of all thank everyone for listening. When I first started doing this podcast, I never thought that I would have people in Australia listening. People in California. I mean, it's everywhere. It really blows my mind. So thank you all. I also do want to remind everyone that you can listen to the Addictions Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and pretty much anywhere you would find podcasts. You can also go to addictionspodcast.com, and from there you can find links to listen to the show on all of those different platforms, and you can actually listen to the show right on the website at addictionspodcast.com. Also on the website for the show, you can find ways to support the show if that's something that you would be interested in doing. There's a link to donate via PayPal, and we have also started doing a Patreon page. This is a page where you donate on a monthly basis, and you can do that for as little as $1 a month. But basically, by doing that, you gain access to a bunch of extra content from the show. For example, I do a lot of videos and stuff, and those are available to Patreon, but only to people who are donating to the show. I have also begun trying to do a weekly audio journal about, how I'm dealing with my addiction and the aftermath, and so on and so forth. So if that's something you're interested in, just go to addictionspodcast.com and click the support the show link at the top of the page. And once again, I would like to send a big shout out and a huge thank you to Scott. He is our first and only patron so far on patreon.com. And if that is something that any of you are interested in doing, you can find more information about that at patreon.com/addictions. Again, that's www.patreon.com/addictions. Now on to the main topic of our show, my personal addiction story. Back in December of 2006, I was about 21 years old. This was 12 years ago. But anyways, I was out doing some shopping with a few of my friends for an upcoming New Year's Eve party. We were buying a literal shitload of booze. I was 21 years old. I was a big drinker. I was a weekend warrior, you might say. Every weekend we were getting drunk, me and my friends. But anyways, it was December, and it was cold outside, but there was really no snow on the ground, and the road conditions were not bad at all. They were just fine. I was driving east at around 55 miles an hour. I was doing the speed limit, and that's when all of a sudden another driver that was heading west in the opposite direction lost control of their vehicle and crossed the center line. And it all happened so incredibly fast that before I could even really think about reacting, I slammed into the other vehicle. I basically T-boned them. And I was in a big, giant 4-door Cadillac, and this other car was a relatively small 2-door car. I hit the other car so hard that it actually flipped the other car onto its top. The car was upside down. But anyways, I was wearing my seatbelt, but my car hit the other car with such an impact that I was thrown into the steering wheel of my car. and this is what broke my femur about 6 inches above the knee, I would say. You can see a photo of the actual x-ray on our website at addictionspodcast.com. And you can check that out. It's pretty gnarly looking. The steering wheel is actually what broke my femur. I'm really lucky to be alive and even here to tell you guys my story. This accident could have been incredibly worse. I mean, if I wouldn't have been wearing my seatbelt and if the airbag hadn't properly deployed, I am almost positive I would have been thrown through the windshield and probably ejected from the car. I do want to kind of describe the accident in a little more detail for you because, to be honest, it was the single scariest experience I have ever went through in my entire life. Now, basically, as I was driving along, minding my own business, and this car in the other lane lost control, and I had very little reaction time to really do anything. And so, instinctively, I stuck my left leg right onto the brake pedal, and that's probably what actually broke my leg. Now, the one thing that I really noticed that was really, really crazy was that as soon as I realized that I was going to hit this car at high speed, it was almost like my perception of time slowed down. I mean, I kept my eyes open for the most part, and as soon as impact was made with the other vehicle, I could watch the windshield in my car kind of in slow motion spiderweb up and then shatter, and everything seemed to go in slow motion. It was very bizarre, but I think that has a lot to do with the fact that in our brains there are certain chemicals that are produced when we are experiencing near-death experiences, or when the brain witnesses something that causes it to feel like it is going to die. One of those chemicals is called DMT. It's a very powerful psychedelic chemical, and it could actually be responsible for like the seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, or having your life flash before your eyes, or these types of things. But it was just really, really wild. As soon as my car came to a stop, I realized I couldn't move my left leg. So I thought right off the bat, yeah, my left leg is definitely broken, so I'm not going to attempt to move. I didn't feel any pain whatsoever. I mean, even when the steering wheel hit my left femur and broke it in half, I felt absolutely no pain. Everything kind of went numb, but I would imagine that the human brain at that point is pumping out loads and loads of adrenaline, and that's probably got something to do with the fact that I didn't really feel any pain, which I am very thankful for. However, when the paramedics did arrive, they had to pull me out of the vehicle, and on the side of the road, they had to put my leg into what is called traction. Now, it's basically they hook a strap around one end of the broken part of the leg and one on the other, and they kind of lock it in place, and then they kind of ratchet strap the leg down so that the bone doesn't float up next to the other part of the bone and start to fuse in an incorrect way, which is a great thing. But having that done on the side of the road at the scene of the accident, they don't know who I am. They don't know if I have allergies to certain medications, so they could not give me any painkillers right there on the side of the road. I had to do that without any painkillers, and let me tell you, it was the most incredibly excruciating pain I have ever felt in my entire life. I can't liken it to any other sort of pain that I've experienced. The paramedic even told me, you can scream, you can punch me. I did both. It was terrible. But once they got me in the ambulance and shot me full of morphine, I was on cloud nine and feeling fine. When we got to the hospital, it was going to be 24 hours before the orthopedic surgeon could be in the following morning, and so I had to wait overnight in traction all night with a counterweight holding the bone away from the other bone so it wouldn't, again, fuse together. I actually had a button for morphine that I could hit every 15 minutes, and I was in a lot of pain, so every 15 minutes I definitely hit that button. The following morning, though, I did go into surgery. It was around a 3-hour-long surgery to insert a titanium rod inside of my femur, my left femur. And, I was totally out. I was on anesthesia for that, but I did come out of the anesthesia and had sort of a bad kind of reaction. I was very agitated and very scared, and slight amnesia, and I was having muscle spasms. So they sent me home with Valium and Vicodin 750. So I was in pain, so I was taking the Vicodin. And at that time, I had no interest in getting high from it. I was somewhat unfamiliar with getting high off opioids. But anyways, they gave me that and one refill. After I went through that, the doctors actually switched my med to a non-narcotic medication. Then when I was through with that, they switched me to yet a different medication, and then back to the Vicodin and repeat the cycle. And during that time, I had absolutely zero problem with substance abuse with any of those pills. I think that's a very good strategy. However, over the years, the next couple of years, this happened in 2006. In 2008, I began to have problems with some of the hardware inside of my left leg and hip. Basically, at the hip, there was a screw that would go horizontally, and at the knee, there was also a screw that went horizontally to hold that titanium rod in place. Now, this top screw in the hip, when I would bend over to a certain degree, it would get caught on a ligament or something. I'm a kind of a small-framed guy, so some of this hardware is actually a little bit too big for my body. So by this time, the femur had healed and it was actually probably stronger than ever before. So I met with another doctor and we made the decision to have the titanium rod removed, which I play the drums, and I have since hooked the titanium rod onto my drum set as a cymbal stand. Quite the conversation starter, but going off on a tangent there. Anyways, I had a surgery scheduled to remove the rod. The recovery time was considerably less than the initial putting in of the rod, which I was happy about. About a year after I had the rod removed, which I would say was, let me think here. The rod was removed in 2009. So 3 years after the accident. I was about 25 years old. About a year after the rod was removed, I began to have a lot of pain. The sciatica, the spinal stenosis, the sacroiliac joint dysfunction, these things began to really rear their ugly head. And I work at a farm. It's a very labor-intensive job. I like my job. I was beginning to have a lot of problems with doing the best that I could at my job because I was experiencing a lot of physical and neuropathic pain. So I talked to my family doctor, and she decided that with the injuries that I had sustained, that I would be a good candidate for opioid pain medication. And so she started me out slow on Norco 5 milligram, which would be hydrocodone. Over time, that was bumped up to 7.5 and then up to 10 milligrams. But, for the first 2 or 3 years of my 4.5-year prescription to these drugs, I was, for the most part, taking them as needed or as directed. And, I didn't have any problems with running out of pills, but even taking them as directed like that, you take them long enough and you're bound to become physically addicted. And that's exactly what happened with me. Now, by around the 4th year of my prescription to hydrocodone, I was taking double doses and things like this because the single doses were no longer really helping with the pain. And so I began calling my prescription in early, and I did that 2 or 3 months in a row. And the first couple of times, the doctor was, really nice about it. No problem. But about the 3rd or 4th time I spoke with my doctor about it, she seemed rather annoyed. But nonetheless, she did refill my prescription. So anyways, about, I would say a couple of weeks went by, and I got a letter in the mail from my doctor, which is kind of strange because they rarely communicate with me via snail mail. And I checked out the letter and read it, and apparently I was no longer a patient with this doctor, which I was absolutely devastated. I knew that I was, physically hooked. I was incredibly worried. And one of the big things that really blows my mind, is about 2 years into my prescription for hydrocodone, I actually went to my doctor and I said, I'm somewhat worried about physical dependence to these types of drugs. And this is exactly what she said to me. And I quote, "We can cross that bridge when we get there. We can treat that," unquote. But, clearly when I did end up with a problem, I was not offered treatment in any way. In fact, I was forced to turn to buying opioids on the street, which that simply spiraled out of control for another 2.5 or so years. In fact, I began buying methadone, morphine, hydrocodone, oxycodone, any opioid I could find because I had to have something. I have a job that I have to be able to maintain, so if I want to avoid withdrawal and avoid being sick and possibly lose my job, I have to find these drugs. But it got to the point where, it was getting out of control. I was spending 75 to 85% of my paycheck every single week on these drugs, and that simply is not feasible. Not at all. And one thing that I really do want to get across here is I am not laying the responsibility at the feet of my doctor. Yes, it was a little irresponsible the way she went about what she went about doing, but the fact of the matter is that, I did have a choice, and I totally understand that. But addiction changes you. It makes you do some very strange things that, you would normally never do. At this time, due to the auto accident that caused all of these injuries, I had insurance through the Michigan no-fault law, which, paid for everything for the rest of my life for this. But it was very difficult to find a doctor in the first place that would accept this type of insurance. And, when withdrawal is imminent within 8 hours, you don't have time to go out and just find another doctor and instantly be prescribed opioid narcotics. So that was another reason that I turned to the street to begin purchasing opioids. And, I would say that I used on the street for probably 2.5 years. Eventually I found out about Suboxone, and I tend to do a lot of research about, certain pills or substances that I find. My motto has always been, if you're going to be stupid, be smart about being stupid. But anyways, I found out about Suboxone, and actually my family doctor runs a Suboxone program, but I went to this doctor and tried to get on the Suboxone program, but at the time she was currently booked. She can only have so many patients in this program at a time. But she told me to call back next month and see if there were any open slots. I did this for 7 months straight and still could not get in. There are other Suboxone programs around in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, but I live out in the country and, I don't have reliable transportation, and Grand Rapids is incredibly far away, so that simply isn't feasible for me. My family doctor works, 5 miles away from me, so that would be simple, that would be great, but I just couldn't get in. So I did some more research, and I took what is called the Clinical Opioid Withdrawal Scale test, the COWS test. I made sure that I scored at the adequate level so that I know I was in physical withdrawal, and I began buying Suboxone off the street. And basically, I took 1 milligram at a time every hour until my withdrawal symptoms were being held at bay. And I basically started out at around 6 to 8 milligrams a day. And slowly over time, I was tapering that dose down and down and down and down until after roughly a year, I got to the point where I could jump off. And don't get me wrong, I still had some physical withdrawal symptoms, but they weren't terrible. But the biggest thing for me is the psychological kind of symptoms, the depression, the anxiety, these types of things. It's very difficult. And for me, doing the podcast like this is incredibly therapeutic, just to know that, there's other people who feel the same way, who have similar stories, and it's like a big community. It's fantastic. But anyways, I was off Suboxone for a period of time and doing really well, but the PAWS, the post-acute withdrawal syndrome, it really sneaks right up on you, and it's a beast. The depression is insane. The anxiety, not to mention that I have post-traumatic stress disorder from an accident at the farm that I work at. That's very personal to me, so it's kind of hard for me to talk about. But anyways, the on top of the chronic pain that I'm having and the intense PAWS symptoms that I'm dealing with, I thought it would be a good idea to get on Suboxone for perhaps a little while longer. And I spoke with my doctor, and we both seem to feel the same way. So I'm going to continue documenting this for all of you. And again, I cannot thank you enough for tuning in, checking this out, and your support is greatly appreciated. And here at the Addictions Podcast, we love you all. So thank you.
You smashed your only car. You aren't what you are really. You missed it by so damn far. Your head feels like it's in a blender, and you hate to see the dawn. Your stomach says return to sender after the buzz is gone. Your Sundays you prayed Uncle John. You poisoned yourself last night. Mary slapped your friend Tom. You got in a hell of a fight. Monday comes and it's back to work. The week seems so damn long. The weekend's past, you're still a jerk after the buzz is gone.